Hello, everyone. Hello to everyone in the David Brower Center as well. Can you say hello to everyone on our second satellite event? We're all assembled. If not physically, we're all together in spirit, and I'm so glad that we could have this incredible collaboration across so many fronts. My name is Shannon Jackson, and thank you. I'm Associate Vice Chancellor for the Arts and Design, and also as a teacher and writer whose work engages with the work of those featured here tonight. It is an absolute thrill, an absolute honor to be able to welcome you to the screening of Frantz Fanon, Black Skin, White Mask. This is a work inside the influential and formative work of an artist, Isaac Julien, filmmaker, whose work includes a whole variety of signature pieces, of course, Looking for Langston, Western Union Small Boats, as well as Capital and Playtime. Indeed, tonight's event is the launch of what will be an extended residency here in the Bay Area as we anticipate the unfolding of Playtime at Fort Mason this weekend. Yeah. Tonight's event, this one at Berkeley, is moving for us here for a number of reasons. This is, to some degree, a kind of homecoming for this film. Frantz Fanon was originally, had a premiere here at the Pacific Film Archive, albeit in different quarters. Tonight we get to share with you an extended version, newly remastered, brought back home to all of us. We also are going to get to follow that screening with a public dialogue with UC Berkeley's own Judith Butler, a critic, teacher, convener, and courageous public interlocutor who will be, I can't imagine a better person to help us think about the increasingly urgent issues that this film addresses and their urgency for our current moment. And Judith, it's really an honor and a comfort and relief to have you home. Yeah. All right. I'm also thrilled to note that Mark Nash, Isaac Julien's longtime collaborator and a key collaborator on Frantz Fanon, is able to join us here tonight. As many of you know, Mark Nash is a critic and curator and also convener whose work thinks deeply about the relationship amongst visual art, film, and global politics in his writing, including his books, Screen Culture Theory, in his past work as editor of Screen, in so much of his teaching and his curating at major venues, including Documenta, and we're thrilled that he'll be able to join the conversation tonight. This event also happens to be the penultimate event in A+D Mondays, Arts Plus Design Mondays, for the 2017 season. And for some of you, this might be the first time you've come to a Monday night event with us. For others, it has become a kind of regular event. Some of us have been told by our colleagues and community that it's fast becoming a tradition. Co-curated by dozens of UC Berkeley departments and centers, presenting venues, museums, it is a place and a series that welcomes the people and ideas that most compel the Berkeley faculty and students. And we've been gathering people around the theme of public reassembly, around that theme and considering its many forms, considering them especially at a time when the democratic and aesthetic and educational values of assembly seem all the more necessary, if all the more banalized and increasingly threatened. So it might be the first A+D Mondays for you, but if it's tradition for others, you'll know that ours is a tradition that welcomes free and accessible assembly, a place of bracing dialogue across disciplines, across art forms, and across political positions. Free access to public assembly is, of course, never actually free. It depends upon the labor of committed staff here at BAM-PFA, such as Dave Taylor, Richard Tellinghuisen, and others. It depends on the expert staff leadership of the core A+D team, including Amber Fogarty, Sarah Fullerton, Tonika Seeley-Thompson, Megan Hetcher, our student team, Derek Duren, Suman Su, Renee Lim, Jesus Serna, and, of course, the intrepid Lauren Pearson. Yeah. Such assembly also depends on other types of resources, including financial ones. And tonight, we are particularly grateful to have the support of Cal alumni and Cal parents, Pamela and Dick Cramlett, who are supporting costs for tonight's event, making sure that this can be accessible to all of you. So, yeah. We actually don't believe here that your ability to have access to cultural dialogue and to work like this should depend on your ability to pay the price of a ticket, to invoke another hero of ours. So if you're here tonight, or if you're in the theater at Brower, or if you're watching from the future on the A+D free YouTube channel, remember the commitment to access, and also join me now in thanking the intrepid team and the Cramlett family for making tonight possible for us. So, such reminders of background labor, of necessary resources, and of necessary gratitude are, of course, the motor of our educational life at Berkeley, about what it means to sustain public values despite public defunding. But even the necessity and even the mundanity of those reminders also occupy, I think, an important political, aesthetic, and philosophical place in our ongoing discussion of public reassembly throughout this series. Indeed, what kind of distributions of cultural and economic resources will produce the kind of world we want to live in? As we consider the legacy of Frantz Fanon tonight, anticipating a discussion of the unequal effects of global capital in the Bay Area with the unfolding of Playtime this weekend, during a week, I'll remind us all that we are about to mark the anniversary of the Ghost Ship fire here in Oakland. We might think about what kind of distributions and assemblages will indeed produce a world worth living in. I don't think we could have found a better trio, a more exciting trio, for helping us think about the connection between the everyday labor of assembly and its extraordinarily potent artistic and political potential. Together and separately, Isaac Julien and Mark Nash have steadily combined and recombined artistic media, working across film, performance, choreography, sound, sculpture, and installation to create new kinds of artistic assemblages that address and excavate issues of race, decolonization, sexuality, global politics, and now the interdependencies of global capital. For her part, Judith Butler's own writing, and perhaps more recently, her writing about the performative nature of assembly, helps bring politics and art back to us anew. Through Judith's committed thinking, we come to understand the deep connection, the intimate connection between embodied gathering and systemic imagining, between extraordinary interventions and the daily necessities of assembling a livable life. I invite them and you now to view Julien and Nash's exploration of another figure, Frantz Fanon, who made a similar commitment in all its psychic complexity, its political dissensus, and its prescient cultural imagining. So if we're ready up there, without further ado, we give you Frantz Fanon, Black Skin, White Mask. We can do another round of applause for these three, can't we?
Yes, Judith had just asked me to start with a very brief kind of description of the process of conserving the film and the status of the two versions. The version which those of you who've seen the film here in the States most likely will have seen a television version, 50 minutes long, that was shown on British television BBC in 1995. and this was the version that was distributed here in the States. But it was always our intention to make a longer feature-length version, and we were able to do that with the help of the Ford Foundation early in 1996. And so that's the version that you see restored tonight. Now, why restored? Well, because in those days, they may seem close to some of us, but it's long enough ago for there to be a different kind of technology at work, so that it is a film which was a mixture of analog and digital material shot on 16mm film, edited digitally, then with a lot of very beautiful digital mixes, as you can see, courtesy of the director. Then it was transferred onto 35mm and shown in that form. When we came then to make a Blu-ray and DVD for release in the UK very recently, the British Film Institute said, well, the quality of this 80s aesthetic is no longer appropriate for the 21st century. We have to have crisp, high-definition images, and we'll give you some money to do that. So we said, okay, we're quite happy to see Colin Salmon looking crisp and high definition, that's fine. What we didn't realize was how much work it would take, because we actually had to go back to the negative and reassemble the film exactly as it was before, and redo the subtitles exactly as they were before. So it's a true restoration, but those are just a few words to describe the whole thing. I would say that this is, as Isaac says, the director's cut. The long version is the version that Isaac and myself and the team always envisaged making.
Isaac, I think we'd also like to hear from you what it is for you now to see this film, to have made and remade this film, and encountered it again. Something you wrought, something you encounter as strange. And it's been, I guess, 20 years since you worked on it, a little bit more. And can you talk to us a little bit about what's different between the older version and the newer one, or is there continuity for you here? Does it live in you in a continuous way, or does it arrive as a new encounter?
Well, I think there's a way that sort of that Fanon was always uncanny, and in terms of this work, our original sort of raison d'etre was connected to questions around race and psychoanalysis, questions of identification, the gaze, and all of these kinds of theories, which, as as a student of semiology and cultural studies, we were very interested in. And I think we were very interested in really someone who could put together all of these disparate theories and ideas in a practice in psychiatry. And of course, we saw him as a kind of black Lacan of sorts. And of course, there's a moment of Fanon mania as well, because for us, in this particular moment, there's a way in which there's lots of different threads which have been brought together in Fanon's work. But I think in making the work, we came across really, of course, the black and white mask Fanon, and then the wretched of the earth Fanon. And I think in making the film, what became uncanny was really how this wretched of the earth signified, especially when it became the sort of looking at questions of mental disorders, and the way in which these questions of coloniality and violence, how all of that became this very resonant sort of aspect of the work in terms of how it drew out in making the work. And I think, of course, the question of terrorism and of violence, I think it was this part which came out in a very strong manner in the process of making the work. And I think perhaps it's that part which lives on. For me, my initial thing was really connected to the questions of the mirror and of wounding, of questions of identification and disidentification, but then I think the question of how that goes into the proximity of war and the way that war in a sense haunts the present, and so I think it's that aspect really that at the end Olivier Fanon is talking about the way in which there's a sort of confusion between the police, the army, and the terrorists, and then how that becomes a kind of confusion, not just in this supposedly third world country, but then becomes part of a kind of global scenario which haunts the very metropolis of the West and impinges on our lives and our every movement within our everyday actions and political thought in the world. So what it seems the kind of southern issue becomes something which is lived and is appropriated politically. And so that's the thing which is that contemporizes Fanon.
Yes, it certainly does, and I'm struck with the fact by the fact that at least when Stuart Hall is describing the way in which a certain Hegelian dialectic emerges within Fanon's work, right? And he also is interested in the Oedipal dialectic, or triangle, as it were. It seems that we know who the masters are and who the slaves are when we're talking about colonial power. And then towards the end, when we don't know who is in what position, and there's this deep epistemic confusion about where the violence is coming from, against whom, it seems that the dialectical structure of master and slave falls away, and a much more complex map emerges, one that doesn't have the same epistemological certainty, doesn't lend that certainty in the way maybe the dialectic would. Yeah, go ahead. Or Mark too, please.
Well, okay. No, I was just going to say, which, I mean, it's a following on rather than a reply, but as you were talking, I was reminded that, of course, The Wretched of the Earth was his last writing. He died shortly afterwards, as we heard in the film. And he died, in a way, he became a kind of hero, a martyr, if you like, and didn't, in a sense, have to see all the forces that he so accurately pinpointed in the work. He didn't actually see how they worked themselves out. So I think the question of the thing that struck us when we restored the work is, as you were saying, how pertinent it is today. I mean, it hasn't aged in a way, except it's become closer. So at the time, we were doing a little reconstruction of women having bombs against the colonizing police force, whereas now, of course, these kinds of attacks are happening in our streets. So in a way, this process has continued into the present. But I think what you were saying about the connection between the psychoanalytic, both Isaac and Judith, and questions of violence, it seems that actually these questions are still open questions that we need to discuss again and again. I, for one, don't even like the use of the word terrorist now. I think it's not terribly helpful because it doesn't give you a situated account of why these actions are taking place by these people who are actually, however horrible we may think they are, they're people like us doing these things, but we use that word to other them. Mm-hmm. You see what I mean? So it's that kind of dynamic which is still going on, and the film somehow managed to kind of comment on that. Mm-hmm.
Well, I have some question about whether it is Wretched of the Earth that lives on most emphatically in the present, because I do think that Black Skin, White Masks continues to be an extraordinarily rich text. Every time I teach it in the present, there are enormous debates and people are engaged by it. I'm not sure we've seen a kind of an analysis of racism in quite the way we receive it in that book, especially Fanon's idea of epidermalization, or what Stewart called, inscribing racism on the skin, just inscribing race on the skin. And I thought, in fact, that your film focuses on skin in a very interesting way. We have lots of close-ups of skin, and we also have close-ups of tactility, moments of touching white fabric, or touching white woman, or touching one's own Black male body, and I think that it gives us a different kind of phenomenological sense of how racism functions in both in everyday ways, through tactility, sense, motion, all of that, at the most basic level of sensing a world, right? And Fanon comes from, he's been reading not just his Lacan, but his Merleau-Ponty, right? He's reading his Karl Jaspers. He's kind of, he wants that textured analysis of the everyday. At the same time, he's going to talk to us about historical racial schemas that have this enormous systemic power, right? And how to do that without it becoming an abstraction, but also relating it to the tactility of the everyday. So I think that also remains for us theoretically and politically a question when we talk about white supremacy as systemic, which we do, and we ought to do, because it is. But of course, it's systemic differently depending where and when we're looking at it. There's not just one single system. It operates through different kinds of modalities of life and through different kinds of orders of the senses. And perhaps Fanon gives us that challenge. Let's talk about racism, but not in such a way that we don't understand the daily problem of moving, of breathing, of fear, of being abraded into non-being, as he puts it, by the look of the other. So I think that's there, and partly also I think that the book is written, some people say it's written in a fragmentary style. I'm not sure it's fragments. It starts and stops. It allows white space to distinguish the paragraphs. It shifts tone. It shifts voice. Sometimes there's a quotation. Somebody's voice is speaking in and through this text, but we don't know who is speaking, and there's not a citation offered because it's language that's floating around. It's language that's being cited all the time. It could be anyone or someone. And so it's not linear, and it's not a systematic text, although I see that there are some philosophers who seek to reconstruct it as a perfectly systematic text, and that's good. I'm glad. But I think that the stop and go of it is important, because it's almost like you have to catch your breath, or something brutal has happened and there's no way to simply go on, right? To take the next step, you're stopped in your tracks, some pause is made. And I was thinking about whether you tried in some ways to translate that visually, and I thought maybe you did. There is obviously a narrative arc to the film, but it's spliced, and there are different times that come in, and different kinds of imagery, different forms of silence. I was wondering whether you had thought about the quality of that text, and what it meant to try to transpose that into a filmic version.
Well, yes, I think in a way we were very much, I mean, funnily enough, in this part of the world, when we were teaching at Santa Cruz in History of Consciousness, at the time when the film was commissioned by the BBC, and we had to leave our class early to start the production of the work. And of course, our conversations at that time were with Stuart Hall and Trezor Loretis and Angela Davis, and all of, in a way, I think the West Coast particularly was interested in a way of the film being able to, be interested in theory and these ideas, but to, in a way, make a translation of those theoretical ideas. And in a way, the film becomes a form of theoretical knowledge itself by the kind of different approaches filmically in terms of its bricolage approach and the use of different textual strategies within the work, and trying to, in a way, encapsulate a rereading of Fanon and Fanonian ideas, and in some ways trying to translate those ideas, and in some instances trying to better them, because we weren't interested in a hagiographic portrait. We wanted to be quite critical of Fanonian ideas in the work, and this is partly one of the reasons why some Fanon scholars got very annoyed with it, and still are. And I think there's a way in which we were really interested in trying to transform some of those ideas in a way that film can, in a very unique manner, and it is connected to montage and is connected to the ways in which there's as you say, a viscerality, a kind of haptic relationship to the gaze, and how that cuts across time and place and the image itself, and how can we make those connections to these important ideas, and at the same time make them resonate in a way. And so that was one of the challenges in terms of making the work, and this intertextual bricolage approach that became an impossibility during the reconservation of the work, because we had to go back to Super 8 film, to high 8 film, to video, to 16mm film, to 35mm film, and all of those, in a way, intertextual registers reflect that kind of language, the poetic language, I think, that was at work in Fanon, which is a kind of open text, which, in a sense, gives the possibility for these many rereadings of Fanon, I think, and his relevance for today. Because, of course, when we think about the way that he inscribes and talks about racism, there's still a kind of lack of language for thinking about that inscription, and we realized that, he gave us that language to a certain degree in the work, and that was why there was such a strong interest in his work. And I think perhaps that's why there still is a strong interest in his work around these very questions, which are connected to Black Skin's White Mask.
I just wanted to add a small comment, which is, having recently re-seen Looking for Langston and now seeing this, I notice, I've been aware of it, but I've noticed that Isaac's got this use of photography as a kind of suture, as a way of moving from one shot to another. So you notice in Fanon there's shots of these photographs which were taken in Tunisia. Have they been placed in these interviews, whether in Paris, and then the camera zooms into them and takes you into another shot. This is very, very elaborate mise en scène, very successful, and somehow doubled again by the quite complex mixes of images which move together. And it connected in my mind to this article that I was reading fairly recently by Etienne Balibar on the theatrical metaphors of the theatrical frame within Althusser's writing, and that, in a way, the notion of the theatrical is under-theorized and under-discussed, and this is a perfect example of that. But that's more like an aside. As I'm seeing it now, I'm thinking, oh, that would be great to to continue to discuss the role of the use of theatre in this form of political representation.
Are you thinking about the use of theater within film, or theater in relationship to film as separate genre?
Well, I'm thinking of the film as a form of a theatre, because the film was set up, as you said, there was a narrative arc, which was a collection, a series of Fanon text, all the words of a Fanon text, which created an arc of ideas that we wanted to bring out. But then, of course, they had to be shot, imagined, and edited, and so on, to make something connect together the way it connects. And it just, maybe it's also association of ideas, seeing it in this amazing theatre, but I think the theatricality is really an interesting aspect of the aesthetics of the work.
I had two more kinds of questions I wanted to ask, and I don't mean to sort of be an interviewer, but one of them has to do with the transition from black skin, white masks to Wretched of the Earth. And I very much appreciated the way the film took us through Fanon as a psychiatrist who was a kind of anti-psychiatrist, right? Unchaining the and trying to decarcerate, unincarcerate the psychiatric patient. So trying to move it out of the prison model and into some way of living that could allow for the person who is suffering to be part of world building. And I thought that was very moving and very important. And then the question is, at what point does he ever leave his clinical role as a psychiatrist to become an activist or a revolutionary? Or is it a transition? Is it a continuity? Is it an abrupt shift? And I think, I know there are many people who try to work on this question, but I felt that the way he was portrayed, he was trying to get to the root of pain in order to alleviate it for people who were obviously suffering enormously. And getting to the root of pain involves a certain kind of radicalism, right? When that is what it is to be radical. It means going to the root. And to the degree that there were social and political conditions, colonial conditions specifically, that were generating and exacerbating what were called mental disorders, it seemed to me that there was no way to alleviate the mental disorder without decolonization, without taking colonial power down, actually, not because Stewart teaches us it's not decolonization, it's rising up against colonial power and taking it down, and that in that act, certain kinds of healing or reparation might take place. Some kind of well-being has a chance. And so I was struck by that. And I just, I wanted to know how you thought about that transition, or if that was something that was a challenge.
Well, I mean, I think in his role as psychiatry, I mean, he has a very ambivalent role, because to a certain extent he is involved in sort of, with the analysand, he's in a way in the process of being part of many practices which involve in a way, in some cases, problematic relations, in terms of the association with his work with, where Simone de Beauvoir talks about these sort of dark secrets, within his own practice, and the difficulty between patients who, are politically against, his role. I mean, so that's why I think as a role it became untenable, and he, stopped. Well, I think the psychiatric practice in his colonial work was very connected to, his role when he was involved with FLN. But obviously, you have to take sides. And I think that problem of taking sides, in a way, when you're a psychiatrist, becomes it's a different role and a different identification politically. But I think we were very interested in this connection to psychiatry and coloniality, and that versus the psychoanalytic, which at the time, there were some people, that of course it's not Lacanianism. He's not interested in language in this sort of way. But I think it's really about when it's put into practice under colonial conditions. And if we think about those colonial conditions in the present, we realize that there's so much unfinished work in that area, in fact. And so, and I think about that question of violence, even in American context, you have, the use of guns and violence and masculinity and kind of madness, and that as something which is highly problematic.
Yeah.
The rational debates around that don't leave the room for what are the kind of more traumatic, psychic sort of elements which are at play, which I think, Fanon, as a psychiatrist, into psychoanalysis, would have been aware of.
That seems true, and I'm struck by the fact that Françoise Vergès has this wonderful role in this film, and she, of course, is the one who has written most about Fanon's work on the mirror stage in Lacan, right? And she has shown, I think, in some pretty clear and persuasive ways, how the reflection in the mirror functions for Fanon as this very shattering reflection, and how to think about colonial power as functioning through, operating through the shattering gaze. Waiting to see himself on the film, or the young child look at a Negro, I'm scared, all become mirror moments that shatter whatever sense of self is built in the midst of colonial and racist regimes. But I also think that she points out something else, which is that this move from, there are two sort of apparent breaks, right? One of them from psychiatry to revolutionary, really, and another from being Martiniquaise to being Algerian, right? And he breaks with France. He breaks with France first, then Martinique, and then, of course, there's some sense in which he becomes Algerian, but then it's almost as if he becomes a psychoanalytic subject at that moment. It's like, well, are you really? Or how do you become Algerian? What does it mean? It's not that I doubt it, but that, Vergès says it was what he found among Algerian men were men who were wounded, castrated, yes, but also courageous, and that this gave him a way to dream masculinity, right? And then, of course, there's a moment, even in Wretched of the Earth, where he imagines this revolutionary power and violence of a man who could leap from one continent to another, an impossible leap, right? An impossible jump, an impossible power, and Achille Mbembe and others, Elsa Dorlin, have both argued this is a dream of muscularity, Like, we shouldn't take that too literally. In other words, he's not saying we should all go work out and become fabulously strong so we can take down the enemy on the street, because that's not going to happen for some of us, okay? But that it's a dream of muscularity, and that the dream character, the fantasy character, is actually what's essential to read there. And it might be important for revolutionary activity to have the impossible dream, the one that's not realized. But maybe the mistake is to take it as a kind of prescription, like, oh, this is the action we must now perform.
Because I think that's what's happened a lot in the kind of recent Fanonian interests, to my mind. You know, there has been this kind of critique which we were kind of offering, but then there's been a kind of retrograde move which is connected to, you know, many important struggles, you know, including Black Lives Matter, etc. In South Africa, you know, we're discussing this sort of real important space that Fanon's text provides. But I think there is this sort of what I want to call a kind of more laissez-faire or tabula rasa Fanonian aspect, which I think, you know, to my mind is a kind of misreading of this emancipatory sort of, you know, desiring sort of subject, which is offered, you know, in his actions and his writings as a kind of manifesto, but not as something which you work with in this more sort of, you know, didactic manner. So,
Could I just amplify just a little bit, because he was, as we were saying, a psychiatrist and professional revolutionary at the same time. So when he was, I mean, we shot in the hospital where he worked in Tunis. Actually, when he's walking down the path with the trees and everything with the shorter guy, that is somebody who worked with Fanon in one of the wards. So there's a kind of attempt to locate it in Tunisia, but at the same time he was a roving ambassador and working on El Mujahid. So he had those two, he occupied those two positions, whether he felt them as contradictory or not. I mean, I think we can speculate, but one of the things we haven't talked about so much is the concept of the new man that comes in. And I was thinking, well, that connects so much with, well, certainly with African utopian socialist dreams in a way that, I mean, Fanon wasn't in the Communist Party, but he was in dialogue with, for example, the Tunisian Communist Party, because when we were doing research, one of the people we talked to was the former head of the Tunisian Communist Party, who said, well, the problem with Fanon was that he took the Maoist line that the peasantry were the revolutionary class. He wasn't so interested in an uprising of the working class. And I mean, I think Fanon was right, because that wasn't going to happen in a country like Algeria. So he wasn't involved. I mean, the notion of revolution which he had was actually a much deeper psychic thing connected to the acts of violence, which, of course, the communist revolutions often were violent, but they didn't come from the same philosophical position. I mean, it's just really occurring to me now as we're talking about it, that that's something interesting to explore, maybe.
You know, there is an interesting moment even in Wretched of the Earth, which is a very strange title for Les Damnés, the damned, right? I mean, which is what it should be. There's an interesting moment where, you know, and I think Sartre actually is responsible for having messed up our understanding of that text to some degree. But it's the moment where he talks about the violent overcoming of colonial powers, and he says very clearly it cannot be the turning of the tables where the oppressed now become the oppressor. He says that one becomes a man through the violent overthrow of colonial domination, precisely in order to become an equal, and for the categories of colonizer and colonized to fall away. So there is this kind of aspiration towards equality and not towards, it's not a romanticization of the violent act itself. And let's also remember that one of the things that the first book lays out is that a black man is not a man. So to assert manhood in a world in which a black man is not a man is to do violence to the epistemic instrument of racism, the epistemic dimension of racism. There's already a violence in asserting equality. So the various meanings of violence, I think, are actually somewhat nuanced there. And there's even a place also in Les Damnés where he talks about being in combat and realizing that the breath of the other against his breath is the same breath. There's no difference between that breath and his breath. So there's an intermingling of bodies that becomes a kind of corporeal figure for the equality that is undermined. It's like an equality that undermines the violent hierarchy that is the basis of the struggle itself, and even emerges weirdly in that moment of bodily proximity. I guess I have to ask you what you think about Lauryn Hill's film on concerning violence. It's a very different film from yours, and the way in which that film moves, takes the language of that text and then moves it, I think, the focus is not really on Algeria so much, but on transnational forms of colonial domination in the contemporary period, especially in Latin America or in the rainforest or something like that. I just wonder if you have some comments for us. Sorry, I have to ask.
I have to confess I haven't seen it.
Oh, wow. Okay. Okay. Well, maybe there's some reasons you haven't seen it.
I think so.
Probably. Yeah. Okay. We don't have to go down that path. All right. Okay. Guys, you want to give us a final thought?
There's no final thoughts. Questions.
Yeah, we can just go to questions if you want. Yeah.
Yes.
Just because of our late night, we probably only have time for 2 questions, so we'll just go with that. So it's better be good.
Do we call people?
Are there answers to the questions or just the questions?
I don't know. Let's take this eager person here.
I'm just going to take a microphone over so we can hear it. Thank you.
Okay. Hi. I'm really honored to be here. My main question about the film's contextuality is, though at the end, it finally came out with Mr. Nash's speaking about the Communist Party in connection to Fanon, and he wasn't part of the Communist Party, but he, was in dialogue during the War of Liberation. Within the film, in the context of what we know of Francis Fanon, was there a choice not to mention socialist Marxist theory outside of the aspect of psychiatry and that perspective, where he made that transition and was able to make a connection through the very ideas of wanting to heal the effects of colonialism, imperialism, racism, as a psychiatrist in that context. And so I just wondered why maybe that didn't come out in the film as much as the other aspects of his life.
But I think in a way we're trying to connect it through analysts. So we have Alice Chaki and Jacques Agelet, who are working as analysts. And so in a sense, I think he explains that sort of question of identification. And I think, of course, in the kind of more sort of contemporaneous description around transnationalism, we make those connections, but I think we're trying to do it in this more personal manner in the work and making that connection be, because of course, Fanon, a bourgeois Martinican trains, as a doctor in, best French schools and becomes, a psychiatrist. But I think there is, of course, this cross-identification that's taking place, as his brother mentions. So I think, perhaps it's in a more familiar kind of sort of passage that we're making those connections than this overtly politicized one, because I guess we're interested in the psychic connections and how those are being run through biography.
Because there's one more. I know there's one more question. As I said, we also at a formal level took as a tranche of texts that we were particularly interested in, and we could have taken other texts of Fanon's which would have enabled us to speak more about questions of socialism and transformation and so on. But we chose, as Isaac says, the psychic one, the psychoanalytic and psychiatric one, because we were both most interested in that at that time. This is 20 years ago, and it was actually an aspect of Fanon's work that was being discussed in the ways which we weren't terribly happy with. So, but maybe since I have the microphone, I could just make the point that this is one of the very few films ever to be made about Fanon, and there have been films that have started and stopped because at an earlier period, certainly the French government didn't want any films made about him. So the question is, in a way, well, there's a lot of films that could be made using those ideas of those books and related discourses which have yet to appear, and it may be concerning violence is one, and we were speaking before the session about the number of young artists who are beginning to take Fanon's texts and make aesthetic statements with them. So there is a great potential in his work for these different kinds of arguments emerging.
Hello, everyone. Thank you. Kind of like two scenes that maybe you could break down further. One is the image of the two black men kissing, and creating that scene, putting that scene, what was the utility specifically of the moment? And I just appreciate the film for, bringing up, the fear to exist in a sense, or the fear of the black body, and also just the scene where Fanon is extremely paranoid. And as we know, in the last days of his life, when he came to the United States, that he was surveillanced and stalked by the US government. So I don't know if you could just speak to the affect of paranoia, fear of the black body, and also those two black men refusing to fear Fanon's gaze.
I think this is where we're doing the translation of Fanonian ideas to a certain extent, and we're kind of extending that. But I think we're also forming our critique. But I think in doing that, we, are trying to express what we saw as the fact that, of course, in his description of the impossibility of the Oedipus complex, you have this manifestation, nonetheless, in terms of his description of godmothers, they're called, and it was amazing to go to Martinique and to go into the archives and to actually find this photograph, that we could have as a kind of representation of this description of this godmother figure, which I think would be called maybe something different today, day, or something like that. But I think there's a way in which, in this returning of this description which Fanon offers, you have this return of the gaze by Cobin Mercer, who is a kind of theorist of Fanonian ideas, but obviously trying to take those in another direction. So yeah, I mean, signs are never fixed. I mean, queers take up Fanonian ideas and translate them into different ends.
Just going to say that although it's a brief moment when Hall talks about desire in the visual field, it seemed to me to be a crucial moment, because he said something like, desire is not just the desire to see, but to see behind, or to see around, and then again with the veil, it doesn't stop you from seeing; it's there to be seen. And I thought that the psychoanalytic problem of desire and its complexity, and even Fanon's own fear, anxiety, was brought out through a visual vocabulary that I'm not sure we would have been able to grasp in that way without your film, and that just struck me as quite stunning, really stunning.